Hello. Today, we uncover the darkest minds, killers so intelligent, they outwitted the law at every turn. Each story is a chilling game of intellect, deception, and deadly precision. Let's begin. 1. Rodney Alcala, the charming genius with a killer smile. When the FBI first reviewed Rodney Alcala's files, one thing stood out: the sheer number of inconsistencies. His crimes stretched across states, decades, and aliases, with a haunting pattern hidden beneath charisma and smiles. It was as if they were chasing a ghost with perfect teeth and a genius mind. Alcala's IQ was estimated to be near 160 higher than Einstein's. He studied film under Roman Polanski, spoke fluently on art and literature, and, perhaps most disturbingly, knew how to manipulate the system. Arrested in the early 1970s for the rape and attempted murder of an 8-year-old, Alcala served less than 3 years before being released. It was a glaring failure of justice, one that he would exploit repeatedly. Rodney didn't just commit murder, he orchestrated it like a symphony. He used photography as bait, luring young women and children under the guise of building modeling portfolios. With his camera in one hand and cruelty in the other, he documented their final moments. Hundreds of photos were later found, many remain unidentified. But what set Alcala apart wasn't just his brutality. It was his uncanny ability to hide in plain sight. In 1978, at the height of his killing spree, he appeared as a contestant on the popular show The Dating Game and won. Smiling, charming, and well-spoken, he completely fooled both the audience and the producers. One of the producers would later say, "He came off as a total gentleman." Beneath that gentleman facade was a man who studied criminal law in prison, later representing himself in court. During his trial, he cross-examined witnesses, quoted philosophers, and even played recordings of his own voice to confuse jurors. Prosecutors described it as a performance worthy of Broadway and just as rehearsed. But genius alone doesn't make a killer. What drove Alcala was something darker: the desire for control. Control over how he was seen, how the murders were carried out, and even how the trial unfolded. His victims were pawns in a game only he understood, one that spanned coastlines and decades. Rodney Alcala was finally convicted in 2010, more than 30 years after his first known murder. The delay wasn't due to lack of evidence, but because Alcala always stayed 2 steps ahead, a master of deception, a genius with blood on his hands. 2. Israel Keyes, the architect of the perfect crime. When investigators finally apprehended Israel Keyes in 2012, what they thought was a single abduction case quickly unraveled into something much darker and far more disturbing. What they had stumbled upon was not just a killer, but a criminal tactician unlike any they'd ever seen. Keyes didn't just murder, he engineered death like an artist designs a masterpiece, with precision, patience, and an eerie commitment to anonymity. Keyes was the embodiment of calculated chaos. Soft-spoken, intelligent, and fiercely disciplined, he studied the failures of other serial killers as if preparing for an exam. He refused to follow patterns. He avoided local victims. He never used the same weapon twice. Most chillingly, he stashed kill kits, buckets filled with guns, duct tape, cash, and disposal tools years in advance, buried across the United States, waiting for the right moment to strike. Born in Utah and raised in a radical, isolated family, Keyes grew up without television, phone, or outside contact. This early detachment from normalcy gave rise to a fascination with power and control. By his teenage years, he was already fantasizing about murder. He later confessed that his first victim was likely in the late 1990s, a couple he abducted while they were hiking. Their bodies were never found. That was part of his plan. He traveled extensively, renting cars and paying with cash, choosing victims at random in cities thousands of miles from home. Random is harder to track, he told the FBI, and harder to connect. He avoided surveillance cameras, chose isolated areas, and deleted all digital trails. It wasn't luck that kept him from being caught for over a decade. It was design. Keyes operated under a strict moral code, his own twisted version of ethics. He would not harm children. He avoided killing close to holidays. He refused to use credit cards during crimes. In one case, He flew from Alaska to Chicago, rented a car, drove over 1,000 miles to Vermont, murdered a couple in their home, and then returned days later, all without raising a single red flag. It wasn't until he broke his own rule, abducting 18-year-old Samantha Koenig in his home city of Anchorage, that the cracks began to form. He held her captive, killed her, and then used her phone and ATM card to mislead authorities. But the trail eventually led back to him. When captured, Keyes smiled. He knew what he had done was almost perfect. What terrified investigators most wasn't the number of victims, which he never fully disclosed, but how coldly methodical he had been. His murders weren't impulsive or emotional. They were projects, missions, puzzles he solved long before anyone knew they existed. Before he could be tried, Israel Keyes committed suicide in his cell. He left behind a cryptic suicide note filled with drawings, fragments of poetry, and one chilling truth. There is no one who knows me or who has ever known me, who knows anything about me. The case remains open. Some of his buried kill kits have never been found. And somewhere out there, the echoes of his untraceable murders still haunt cold case files. 3. Edmund Kemper, the killer who understood himself too well. When Edmund Kemper walked into the Santa Cruz Police Department in April 1973 and calmly confessed to murdering his mother, the officers didn't believe him. At 6 feet 9 inches tall and nearly 300 pounds, Kemper, nicknamed Big Ed, was a giant of a man. But what struck officers even more than his size was his intelligence. With an IQ of 145 and a cold, meticulous nature, Kemper wasn't just a killer, he was a self-aware monster. Born in California in 1948, Kemper's early life was steeped in psychological trauma. He was abused, emotionally isolated, and locked in a basement by his mother, a woman he would later describe as the root of all his hatred. By age 15, he murdered both his grandparents just to see what it felt like. After being institutionalized, doctors noted his extraordinary intellect and deep insight into his own pathology. Ironically, this intellect led to his early release at age 21. The system had believed him cured. It was one of its gravest errors. Kemper knew how to play people. He had charm. He volunteered with police officers, hung out in their favorite bars, and learned how investigations worked. They called him Big Ed and treated him like a harmless oddball, unaware he was listening for every tactical detail. It was part of his strategy. From 1972 to 1973, Kemper launched into a series of grisly murders in the Santa Cruz area. His victims were mostly young, female college students. He would pick them up while hitchhiking, often under the pretense of being friendly or helpful. Once inside his car, they were trapped. He disabled the handles, hid weapons, and wore a mask of gentle conversation right up until the moment he struck. But what made Kemper truly disturbing was not just the murders, it was the post-mortem rituals. He decapitated victims, kept body parts, and engaged in necrophilic acts. He later described his actions with clinical detachment, saying, "If I killed them, at least they were mine." His killings were not fueled by impulse, but by a deeply rooted compulsion to dominate physically, emotionally, sexually. The most chilling aspect, he knew he was evil. Kemper spoke openly in interviews and psychiatric evaluations, analyzing his own behavior with shocking clarity. He could explain the origin of his rage, the trigger of each murder, and the guilt that would come afterward. "I was the only one smart enough to know how screwed up I was," he said, "and too screwed up to do anything about it." In the end, Kemper turned himself in. After killing his mother, the ultimate object of his hatred, and her best friend, he realized he had completed his cycle. There was no one left to blame. Now serving 8 life sentences, Kemper has become a subject of criminal psychology and behavioral profiling. His interviews are still used by the FBI to understand other serial offenders. He remains eerily cooperative, articulate, and composed. A man who sees his own monstrosity and does not flinch. He is proof that intelligence without empathy is a weapon more dangerous than any knife or gun. And in the case of Edmund Kemper, that weapon was turned on innocence and on himself. 4. Ted Kaczynski, the genius who declared war on modern society. in a remote Montana cabin devoid of electricity, running water, or human contact. One of the most intelligent domestic terrorists in American history handcrafted his own war against the modern world. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was not just a killer. He was a mathematician, philosopher, and recluse whose crimes stemmed not from chaos, but from chilling ideology. Born in 1942, Kaczynski was a child prodigy. He skipped 2 grades, entered Harvard at 16, and earned a PhD in mathematics from the University of Michigan. Professors described his intellect as brilliant, bordering on otherworldly. But behind his academic achievements lay a growing resentment, one that would fester into violent extremism. After resigning from a brief career in academia, Kaczynski withdrew from society altogether. He built a 10 by 12-foot cabin in Lincoln, Montana, living off the grid. It was there, isolated from the world he had grown to hate, that he conceived his plan to cripple the system through terror. Between 1978 and 1995, Kaczynski mailed or hand-delivered 16 homemade bombs to universities, airlines, and corporate executives. The devices were sophisticated, crafted with no fingerprints, made from scrap metal, batteries, and wood. Each was designed to maim or kill, and they did. His bombs injured 23 and killed 3, including a computer store owner and a Yale forestry professor. But what made the Unabomber unique wasn't just his ability to evade law enforcement, it was his manifesto. In 1995, Kaczynski sent a 35,000-word document titled Industrial Society and Its Future to major newspapers, threatening further violence unless it was published. The manifesto argued that technological advancement was destroying human freedom, dehumanizing society, and leading to ecological collapse. It wasn't incoherent rage, it was a calculated philosophical critique from a man who truly believed he was saving the world. Law enforcement was baffled. The FBI's investigation, codenamed Unabomb, University and Airline Bomber, became the longest and most expensive manhunt in U.S. history. Despite 17 years of forensic profiling and psychological analysis, the Unabomber left no digital trail. He used old-fashioned tools, wrote in block letters, and left almost no physical evidence. His capture came not from forensic genius, but from linguistic analysis and a brother's conscience. When the manifesto was published, David Kaczynski recognized the voice behind the words. He alerted the FBI, and agents arrested Ted in April 1996 at his cabin, surrounded by bomb-making materials and journal entries detailing every attack. In court, Kaczynski refused to plead insanity. He viewed himself as a political prisoner, not a madman. Eventually, to avoid the death penalty, he accepted life imprisonment without parole. He remained unrepentant, stating in later writings that he regretted only not doing more. Kaczynski's story isn't just about murder, it's about the horrifying intersection of intellect and ideology. His bombs weren't random, they were arguments, violent theses, delivered through wire and fire. He used his intelligence not to elevate humanity, but to strike at its core. He believed society had lost its soul to machines, and he sacrificed lives to prove his point. 5. Dr. Harold Shipman, the doctor of death who wrote his own death certificates. In the small, tight-knit town of Hyde, England, Dr. Harold Shipman was seen as a pillar of the community, a trusted family physician who made house calls, remembered birthdays, and offered comfort during the hardest moments of life. But behind that white coat was one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. With a pen, a syringe, and a carefully constructed illusion of care, Shipman murdered over 200 patients, possibly more, all while being respected, trusted, and utterly unsuspected. Born in 1946, Shipman was the second of 4 children and showed early signs of academic brilliance. His mother, whom he adored, died of cancer when he was 17, an event that shaped his perception of death and control. Witnessing her receive morphine for pain and the calmness of her passing would later become a blueprint for how he took lives. He graduated from Leeds School of Medicine in 1970 and began practicing medicine. Early in his career, Shipman was caught forging prescriptions for opiates and briefly entered a drug rehabilitation program. But this warning sign was brushed aside. He resumed his career, eventually opening his own practice in Hyde, where his killing spree began in earnest. Shipman's method was chillingly simple. He administered lethal doses of diamorphine, medical heroin, to elderly patients, usually women, and then falsified their medical records and death certificates to cover his tracks. Most victims were found peacefully in their homes or hospital beds, their deaths attributed to natural causes. Families trusted his word implicitly. After all, he was the doctor. What set Shipman apart from other serial killers was not just his staggering victim count, it was the cold, clinical efficiency of his crimes. He didn't kill out of frenzy, jealousy, or rage. He killed because he could. His intellect, sharp and methodical, enabled him to manipulate systems, forge documents, and create a near-flawless facade. But the pattern began to crack in 1998, when the daughter of 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy, a well-known local woman, grew suspicious. Shipman had not only signed her death certificate, but also had a bizarrely worded will drafted, in which she left nearly her entire estate to him. The daughter, a lawyer, contacted authorities. That was the beginning of Shipman's unraveling. Exhumations revealed lethal levels of diamorphine in multiple bodies. An audit of his patient records showed disturbing spikes in death rates, particularly during his work hours. Police eventually discovered that Shipman had been killing for decades, undetected. The final toll? At least 215 confirmed deaths. Some estimates pushed the number over 250. In 2000, Shipman was convicted of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery, sentenced to life imprisonment. He never admitted guilt, never showed remorse. In 2004, he hanged himself in his prison cell, a final act of control over a life system he had manipulated so expertly. Harold Shipman didn't need to hide in shadows or alleyways. He wore a stethoscope, not a mask. His genius wasn't in his escape, it was in his deception. He weaponized trust, cloaked himself in authority, and quietly became one of history's deadliest predators. 6. Jack the Ripper, the phantom genius who vanished without a trace. No name in criminal history conjures more mystery, dread, and obsessive speculation than Jack the Ripper. Between August and November of 1888, this faceless figure terrorized London's East End, brutally murdering at least 5 women, all prostitutes, and vanishing without leaving behind a single definitive clue. More than a century later, the Ripper's identity remains one of the most infamous unsolved enigmas in criminal investigation. But what made this killer so uniquely terrifying wasn't just the gore, it was the chilling intelligence behind the spectacle. The Ripper didn't just kill, he orchestrated horror. His victims were mutilated with surgical precision, organs removed with anatomical knowledge, throats cut swiftly and efficiently. Investigators quickly suspected they were dealing with someone educated, perhaps even a doctor or a butcher. Yet, in the grim alleys of Whitechapel, there were hundreds of such men, and the Ripper seemed to know that. He chose his victims carefully. All were impoverished women, living transient lives in the slums, which made their disappearances seem almost inevitable to a society that already saw them as disposable. But what he did to their bodies and how he left them was anything but random. Each murder escalated in brutality and theatricality. By the time Mary Jane Kelly, the Ripper's final canonical victim, was found in her room, her corpse had been eviscerated nearly beyond recognition. Her organs were spread across the bed like a grotesque message. And then, silence. The Ripper stopped, or he moved, or died. No one knows, but his sudden disappearance was as calculated as his entrance. He left behind no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no definitive murder weapon, and, most infuriating of all, no clear motive. Instead, he left only questions and fear. The psychological profile that modern experts have constructed paints a chilling picture. Jack the Ripper likely had a high IQ, an intimate knowledge of both human anatomy and urban geography, and a deep hatred toward women, specifically prostitutes. whom he may have viewed as the source of personal trauma or humiliation. He craved power, not just over his victims, but over the public and press. And he got it. He toyed with authorities through letters, some signed Jack the Ripper, others smeared with blood. Whether authentic or hoaxes, the letters fueled panic and media frenzy. London was gripped by hysteria. Police flooded Whitechapel. Citizens formed vigilante groups. Newspapers sold by the millions. All the while, the Ripper watched from the shadows, perhaps even walking among the investigators, amused by their desperation. Despite hundreds of suspects and decades of theories ranging from royal conspiracies to deranged artists, no one has ever been definitively identified. And that, perhaps, is his final masterpiece. Jack the Ripper wasn't just a killer. He was an enigma, a symbol of how intelligence, when driven by madness and cloaked in mystery, can become a myth that outlives truth. He outwitted 19th century law enforcement with tactics still baffling to modern criminologists. He became the prototype for every smart killer who would follow: precise, theatrical, untraceable. Jack the Ripper disappeared, but his legacy never did. These 6 killers weren't just murderers, they were masterminds. Each wielded intelligence like a weapon. Ocala used charm and law, Keyes used systems and planning, Kemper wielded self-awareness, Kaczynski ideology, Shipman authority, and the Ripper mystery itself. In a world where justice relies on patterns, these predators shatter the rules. And in doing so, they remind us of the most frightening truth in criminal psychology. The smartest monsters often look nothing like monsters at all.